good evening, or perhaps good morning, depending on where you are. Welcome to this quiet corner of time, a place where curiosity and rest meet. As you listen, take a moment to notice the space around you. Maybe you're lying in bed, ready to drift into sleep. Maybe you're somewhere else. Headphones on, lights low, letting the rhythm of words carry you gently forward. Wherever you are, and whatever the hour, you're part of a circle that stretches across the world. Listeners in different countries, under different skies, sharing the same story together. I often wonder where you're tuning in from. Are you listening from a city alive with neon, or from a countryside where the stars are bright? Is it the end of a long day, or the beginning of a quiet dawn? These questions remind us that though we are scattered across continents, we are united here in this moment by the simple act of wonder. If you find peace in these journeys, if you feel part of this circle of dreamers, you're welcome to join more of them, only if you wish, of course, but subscribing keeps this gentle ritual alive. And now, let's step into the mystery together. Tonight, we travel back to a time when Earth nearly died. Long before humans, before the age of dinosaurs, there was a world full of life, forests stretching for miles, strange reptiles basking in the sun, oceans teeming with coral reefs and ammonites. It was a planet thriving, alive in every corner. Yet, in the blink of geological time, that abundance collapsed. More than 9 out of 10 species disappeared. Oceans emptied, forests withered. Silence fell where once there was endless song. It was the most devastating extinction event in Earth's history. The Permian-Triassic catastrophe, often called the Great Dying. Science tells us fragments of this story. Volcanic eruptions in Siberia covering millions of square kilometers with fire, greenhouse gases thickening the atmosphere, methane boiling from the seas, oceans stripped of oxygen, air poisoned by sulfur and ash. The planet itself seemed to turn against life, unraveling ecosystems that had thrived for hundreds of millions of years. And yet, even with research, questions linger. Why was this extinction so severe? Why did it erase nearly everything? What secrets lie hidden in the rocks, waiting to be understood? Imagine standing there, not as a human, but as a witness. You would see skies darkened for years, forests collapsing, rivers choking with ash, seas suffocating under toxic blooms. You would hear not the calls of animals, but the echo of emptiness, a world unraveling into silence. What would it have felt like to survive in that age, when survival itself seemed impossible? And here's the mystery. Without this extinction, the world as we know it would never have come to be. The Great Dying cleared the stage for the rise of the dinosaurs, and far later for mammals and humans. In its devastation, it created the conditions that would shape the future. Destruction and creation bound together, written into Earth's deep time. Tonight, as you listen, let yourself drift into that story. Let it carry you across silence and fire, through the memory of loss and the promise of renewal. This is not only a tale of extinction, it is a meditation on resilience, on fragility, and on the mysteries that still live in stone. So settle in, breathe softly. The Earth has a story to tell, the story of the time it almost lost everything. To understand the magnitude of the Great Dying, we must first linger in the world that came before it. Between 260 and 252 million years ago, Earth appeared to thrive. The continents were welded together into the immense landmass of Pangaea. And though its climates were harsh, life adapted with astonishing ingenuity. Forests rose along coasts and river valleys, their shadows cast across swamps that stretched for miles. Amphibians thrived in wetlands, reptiles roamed the uplands, and the seas shimmered with ecosystems older than imagination. It was, in every sense, a living world, lush, restless, full of voices that would soon fall silent. In the lowlands and swamps, coal forests grew thick, towering conifers, seed ferns, and other gymnosperms created canopies that dimmed the light. Beneath them, the ground was tangled with ferns and horsetails, roots knitting into spongy soil. These forests were the green engines of their age, feeding insects, amphibians, and herbivorous reptiles. Dragonflies with wingspans wider than a modern hawk skimmed the air, their flight possible thanks to oxygen levels higher than today's. Millipedes the length of cars crept among the undergrowth. Life had not only adapted to Pangaea's extremes, it had expanded to fill every niche. On land, the stage was shared by synapsids, the so-called mammal-like reptiles. Some were small, nimble insect hunters, while others, like the tusked dicynodonts, grazed in herds across plains. Gorgonopsids, sleek, saber-toothed predators, ruled as apex hunters, their skulls armed with fearsome teeth and their bodies built for ambush. These creatures carried within them the first hints of mammals to come: differentiated teeth, warm-bloodedness, even possible whiskers. They dominated landscapes for tens of millions of years, giving the impression of permanence. Yet permanence, we will learn, was an illusion. Amphibians, too, flourished. Relics of older ages, they grew to enormous sizes, some stretching as long as crocodiles. Rivers and lakes rippled with their presence, their gaping jaws waiting for prey to swim too close. Alongside them, reptiles tested new forms, experimenting with adaptations that hinted at the lineages that would one day give rise to dinosaurs. The land was a theater of transition, each creature both the end of one story and the beginning of another. The seas held even greater abundance. Coral reefs spread wide, built not by the corals we know today, but by ancient rugose and tabulate corals, along with sponges and algae. Ammonites, with their coiled shells, drifted through waters rich with fish and sharks. Trilobites, survivors of earlier ages, still clung to existence, though their glory was fading. Brachiopods and crinoids carpeted the seafloor, waving gently in currents. Oceans that would later choke with anoxia were, in this moment, alive with shimmering color and sound. To swim there would have been to enter a world of delicate balance and dazzling diversity. And yet, beneath this abundance, fragility whispered. Fossil records show hints of ecosystems already stressed. Diversity declining, forests shifting, oceans fluctuating. Perhaps the seeds of collapse were already planted, invisible to the creatures that lived unaware of their impending fate. From our vantage point, we see a world teetering on the edge, but to them, it must have felt timeless. Forests always grew, rivers always flowed, predators always hunted. They did not know they lived in an age soon to vanish. This was Earth before the fall, a planet filled with life, yet balanced precariously, as if standing on glass. The abundance was real, the stability deceptive. In just a geological heartbeat, it would all be undone, reminding us that even the richest chapters of Earth's story can end in silence. The late Permian Earth was not only abundant, but interconnected, a web of ecosystems that seemed unshakable. Vast river systems tied forests to wetlands, wetlands to floodplains, and floodplains to seas. Herbivores grazed in herds, predators stalked the edges, insects hummed in clouds above. It was a choreography of life, each movement sustaining another. To a witness then, it might have seemed eternal, but in hindsight we see its fragility, how every strand of that web depended on delicate balances of climate, oxygen, and stability. One of the defining features of this time was oxygen itself. Levels in the atmosphere were higher than today, fueling both abundance and gigantism. Insects could grow enormous, reptiles pushed into new ecological experiments. Fires burned readily in oxygen-rich forests, clearing land and creating cycles of regrowth. Yet this same abundance meant ecosystems leaned heavily on a fragile equilibrium. When oxygen levels later dropped, many creatures could not cope, their biology tied to a condition that no longer existed. Plants were equally vital to this ancient world. Seed-bearing gymnosperms spread widely, dominating uplands with their resilience to drier conditions. Glossopteris, with its tongue-shaped leaves, flourished across Gondwana, its fossils now scattered across continents as proof of Pangaea's unity. These plants stabilized soils, fueled herbivores, and shaped climates by drawing carbon from the air. They seemed eternal, carpeting valleys and hills alike. And yet, Like so much of late Permian life, their dominance was bound to end abruptly. In the oceans, reefs formed ecosystems, staggering richness. Rugose corals and sponges built vast marine structures that teemed with fish, ammonites, and invertebrates. These reefs had stood for millions of years, weathering smaller extinctions and shifts in sea level. To the creatures that lived there, they must have felt indestructible, eternal cities beneath the waves. But within a few million years, they would collapse entirely, replaced only much later by the corals we know today. The reef gap in the fossil record is a haunting reminder of how stability can vanish. Predators of the land painted the age with drama. Gorgonopsids, sleek and powerful, were unrivaled hunters. Their saber-like teeth tore through prey with brutal efficiency, their reign seemingly secure. Dicynodonts grazed in herds, their tusks and beaks adapted to hardy vegetation. Cydon, smaller relatives of mammals, scurried in burrows, their survival strategies foreshadowing resilience that would carry their descendants beyond extinction. Each of these lineages, magnificent in its own way, carried within it both triumph and vulnerability. And yet, if we step back, a pattern emerges, abundance masking fragility. The forests that seemed endless depended on oxygen levels that could shift. The reefs that thrived on stability collapsed when chemistry changed. The predators and prey, bound in their cycles, could not foresee disruption from outside their world. To them, tomorrow promised more of the same. To us, their world is a prelude, a stage set for tragedy. This was Earth on borrowed time, a lush, abundant world, rich with creatures and forests, seas and skies. But every river, every forest, every reef was balanced on a knife edge. They did not know it, but the world's greatest catastrophe lay just ahead. The great dying would erase their permanence, leaving only fragments in stone, and from those fragments we piece together the memory of a world unaware it was living in its final days. When we picture Pangaea in its prime, we must first imagine scale, a single landmass stretched across much of Earth, bound together in unity that reshaped the planet's climate, ecosystems, and destiny. From pole to pole, mountains rose, deserts sprawled, and coasts met a single, endless sea. Panthalassa. This was Earth's canvas during the late Permian, vast, unbroken, and extreme. The size of Pangaea created a phenomenon scientists call continentality. The interior of the supercontinent, far from moderating seas, experienced punishing extremes. Summers scorched with relentless heat, while winters plunged into biting cold. Rain rarely reached the middle. Instead, it fell mostly along the coasts, leaving the heartland a barren desert. Imagine standing in this interior. No relief from ocean breezes, no nearby lakes of significance, only endless dunes shimmering under the sun. Life could survive, but it did so under constant strain. Along the coasts, however, the story was different. Rivers carried moisture inland, and monsoonal rains drenched valleys. Forests of seed ferns and conifers rose along riverbanks. Ferns carpeted the ground, and swamps teemed with amphibians and reptiles. Oceans nearby moderated the climate, making these edges rich and habitable. Insects swarmed in clouds, reptiles grazed, predators hunted. Where water was abundant, life flourished in dazzling variety, proof that even in a world of extremes, abundance found its way. Mountains also traced Pangaea's seams. The Appalachians, today worn down to rolling ridges, were in that age still mighty ranges, the result of collisions that bound continents together. Their peaks rivaled modern Himalayas, catching storms and feeding rivers that carved valleys below. Across the globe, the Urals rose as another scar of collision, marking the boundary between ancient Europe and Asia. These mountains shaped weather, guided rivers, and created habitats in their shadows. They were Pangaea's spines, testaments to the violence of its assembly. For creatures living on Pangaea, geography was destiny. Synapsids grazed along coasts where vegetation grew thick, while deserts excluded life from their depths. Amphibians clung to rivers and lakes, unable to stray far from water. Predators roamed where prey clustered, their ranges dictated by the geography of survival. Every adaptation, every migration, every cycle of life was bound by the vastness of Pangaea and the extremes it imposed. Yet in this abundance and challenge lay vulnerability. Forests on the edges depended heavily on rainfall patterns tied to geography. Deserts at the core pressed outward, ready to expand at the first shift in climate. Mountains could nurture but also isolate. Oceans moderated coasts, but only to a point. Pangaea was magnificent, yes, but its unity was also its fragility. A disruption of climate or chemistry would ripple through ecosystems already stretched thin. This world of grandeur stood unknowingly at the edge of collapse. The sheer scale of Pangaea reshaped winds and rainfall in patterns unfamiliar to us today. With one landmass blocking atmospheric circulation, monsoons became exaggerated, drenching one side of the continent while leaving the other parched. Storms gathered along coasts and rift valleys, unloading torrents that carved canyons and nourished fertile plains. But these rains rarely reached the center. Instead, the interior baked beneath skies, empty of clouds, deserts expanding until they spanned regions larger than modern continents. The contrast was stark. Edges of abundance, centers of silence. Fossil pollen and plant remains tell the story of these zones. Along coastal belts grew rich forests dominated by seed ferns, cycads, and conifers, while inland, hardy plants clung to dry soils or vanished altogether. In some areas, river deltas formed lush oases, their fertility supporting diverse assemblages of reptiles and amphibians. Elsewhere, wind-sculpted dunes towered hundreds of feet high, their shifting sands leaving behind little trace of the creatures that once wandered there. To live in Pangaea was to exist in a patchwork, survival dictated by proximity to water. The oceans played a decisive role in this pattern. Panthalassa, vast and uninterrupted, circled the globe, influencing global climate. Its immensity made currents sluggish, its depths slow to change. Coastlines along Pangaea faced this endless sea, subject to tides and storms that shaped coastal ecosystems. Marine life thrived in shallow shelves, where sunlight could reach reefs and vegetation. Further out, the ocean was a desert of water, its immensity both cradle and challenge to life. Geological clues also remind us that Pangaea's climate was unstable. Layers of rock reveal alternating periods of wet and dry, cycles of abundance and scarcity. These oscillations were likely tied to shifts in Earth's orbit and the arrangement of land and sea. Imagine generations of creatures adapting to a humid, lush world, only for their descendants to face droughts spanning centuries. Adaptability was not optional. It was survival itself. Speculation lets us paint this world in living color. Perhaps along the margins of deserts, herds of dicynodonts trudged in long lines, searching for greener valleys. In monsoonal forests, insects filled the air, their hum rising into a constant drone. Rivers, swollen with seasonal floods, may have carried fish into temporary lakes, drawing predators to their shores. At night, skies above the deserts must have glowed with unbroken stars, while storms raged on distant horizons. For creatures alive then, Pangaea was immense beyond measure, a world both bountiful and merciless. Yet all of this magnificence carried fragility. One shift in rainfall could doom forests. One fluctuation in ocean chemistry could dismantle reefs. The very geography that made Pangaea unique also left it vulnerable. Its deserts could spread, its coasts could drown, its ecosystems could unravel. From the perspective of today, we see a supercontinent balanced on a knife's edge, its unity making it strong, yet perilously exposed. The heart of Pangaea was a place of paradox, vast, commanding yet inhospitable. Fossil evidence suggests immense deserts sprawled across its interior, regions where rainfall was so scarce that forests could not take root. Sand dunes migrated with the wind, burying traces of life and erasing ecosystems before they could leave their mark. If you stood there, The horizon would stretch endlessly, broken only by heat shimmer and the occasional ridge. To early reptiles, survival in such places demanded endurance, and many never returned from their crossings. By contrast, the edges of Pangaea were worlds of vitality. Coastal belts, nourished by rivers and rains, became havens for plants and animals. These margins formed ecological corridors where life flourished, linking forests, wetlands, and estuaries. Amphibians clung to swamps, fish filled lagoons, and predators hunted where prey gathered in abundance. To walk along such a coast would be to hear a symphony of sounds, the calls of synapsids, the hum of insects, the rush of water, a stark contrast to the silence of the deserts within. Mountains added their own drama. When continents collided to form Pangaea, chains like the Appalachians and the Urals rose high, casting shadows over valleys and altering wind and rain. In their foothills, microclimates emerged, cradling unique communities of plants and animals. These mountain zones were both refuge and barrier, protecting life yet isolating it, shaping evolution in subtle ways. Their grandeur reminds us that Pangaea was not uniform. It was a mosaic of contrasts, forged by collision and shaped by extremes. The term continentality captures the essence of Pangaea's climate. With so much land far from the sea, temperatures swung violently between seasons. Summers scorched, winters froze, and life adapted to cycles harsher than any we know today. Forests grew resilient to drought. Animals developed behaviors to cope with scarcity, and ecosystems evolved at the edge of endurance. Pangaea's size was its defining feature, and also its curse. Speculation leads us deeper into its atmosphere. Perhaps dust storms rolled across the deserts, carrying fine sands that darkened distant skies. Perhaps along coastlines, thunderheads rose in spectacular storms, their lightning flashing over forests teeming with life. Inland, nights may have been bitterly cold, the silence broken only by the footsteps of a lone predator searching for prey. To imagine Pangaea in its prime is to see both majesty and fragility, a world vast beyond our comprehension, yet finely balanced, vulnerable to disruption. That disruption would come. The very geography that shaped abundance also made collapse possible. Ecosystems clustered along narrow belts of habitability, dependent on rainfall and stable climates. The deserts pressed outward, ready to expand. Oceans, immense but sluggish, carried within them the seeds of stagnation. And Pangaea's grandeur was real, but it masked an underlying truth. This world was living on borrowed time. Before the silence fell, Earth's stage was alive with actors as strange as they were magnificent. The late Permian world was not empty desert alone, but filled with creatures that tested evolution's possibilities. Each lineage bore its own story, some destined for extinction, others to give rise to futures we now inhabit. On land, the undisputed rulers were the therapsids, the so-called mammal-like reptiles. Among them were the mighty dicynodonts, stocky herbivores with beaked mouths and tusks jutting from their jaws. Fossil evidence suggests they traveled in herds, grazing across valleys and plains, much like elephants or bison do today. Imagine the sound of dozens of them moving together, their weight pressing into soil, their calls echoing across the land. In their eyes we glimpse both reptilian ancestry and mammalian destiny, for from these forms would eventually arise the line that leads to us. Balancing the dicynodonts were predators, sleek and deadly. Chief among them were the gorgonopsids, with saber-like teeth, long bodies, and powerful limbs. They were the apex hunters of their age. Picture one lurking at the edge of a swamp, its breath misting the dawn air, its gaze fixed on a careless prey animal, their skulls preserved in stone, reveal adaptations for biting deep, for ending struggles quickly. In them we see shadows of later predators, yet they remain uniquely their own, creatures of a vanished experiment in carnivory. Smaller therapsids, like the cynodonts, filled ecological gaps. Some scurried through underbrush, feeding on insects. Others hunted small vertebrates. These were nimble, resourceful animals, showing early signs of mammalian traits, differentiated teeth, possible whiskers, and a metabolism leaning toward warm-bloodedness. In burrows and dens, they may have cared for young in ways that hint at parental behaviors to come. While gorging opposites would vanish in the Great Dying, cynodonts endured, carrying forward the thread of survival that would one day lead to mammals. Alongside the therapsids, amphibians continued their ancient reign. Some were massive, crocodile-sized creatures that lurked in rivers and lakes, snapping at anything that strayed too near. Others remained smaller, clinging to damp habitats, their lives forever tied to water. Their croaks and splashes must have filled wetlands with sound, a chorus older than the forests around them. They were reminders of an earlier Earth when amphibians had dominated before reptiles rose. By the late Permian, their glory was fading, yet they remained part of the living mosaic. And towering over the undergrowth were insects of astonishing size. Giant dragonflies, with wingspans over 2 feet, glided through forests, their gossamer wings flashing in the sun. Millipedes longer than a human crept across damp soils, their many legs rippling in waves. In the warm, oxygen-rich air, arthropods thrived, their buzzing, clattering, and clicking a constant background to life's theater. Imagine walking through a Permian forest, the air thick with the drone of wings, the underbrush alive with movement, every step stirring hidden multitudes. This was the soundscape of the late Permian, the rumble of herds, the cries of predators, the croaks of amphibians, and the endless hum of insects. To the creatures alive then, it was normal, unremarkable, the music of existence. To us, it is haunting, because we know it was the overture to silence. If the land offered a spectacle of therapsids, amphibians, and insects, the seas were no less magnificent. The late Permian oceans teemed with creatures, each part of ecosystems that had evolved over hundreds of millions of years. To dive into those waters would be to enter a realm dazzling with shape and color. Reefs alive with organisms, open seas filled with hunters and drifters, the surface shimmering with sunlight. It was a world as vibrant as any coral reef today, yet entirely alien. The backbone of marine abundance lay in reefs, though not the coral reefs we know. Instead, ancient rogose and tabulate corals, joined by sponges and algae, built massive structures along shallow continental shelves. These reefs stretched for kilometers, rising like underwater cities. Fish darted among the branches, mollusks clung to crevices, and invertebrates filtered nutrients from the water. The hum of life here was ceaseless, a pulse that kept marine ecosystems balanced. Imagine sunlight flickering down through turquoise waters, illuminating forests of coral alive with motion, colors shifting with each current. Drifting through the seas were the ammonites, cephalopods encased in elegant coiled shells. Their spirals were more than decoration. They were chambers of buoyancy, allowing these creatures to rise and fall with precision. Some were small as a coin, while others grew to the size of dinner plates. They hunted with tentacles, their eyes sharp and curious, their movements guided by jets of water. Their shells, now turned to stone, gleam in fossils, like echoes of a vanished sea. To swim among them would have been to watch living jewels, spirals flashing in the dim light of deep time. Beneath them, the seafloor belonged to the trilobites, ancient arthropods that had once ruled the oceans for over 270 million years. By the late Permian, they were diminished, but not gone. They crept across sediments, scavenging and filtering, their segmented bodies rippling like armored waves. Though they had endured countless upheavals, they were nearing their final chapter. The great dying would erase them forever, their lineage extinguished after surviving so long. Their absence from today's seas is one of the extinction's most haunting legacies. Other invertebrates added texture to this world. Brachiopods, shellfish unlike clams, dotted the seabed, their valves opening and closing as they filtered food from currents. Crinoids, sometimes called sea lilies, extended feathery arms into the water, swaying like plants. Though they were animals, schools of fish, armored and swift, wove among these communities, hunted by sharks and predatory bony fish. The oceans of the late Permian were not empty, but structured, layered and alive with ancient diversity. Yet, as with the land, fragility lingered beneath the surface. These ecosystems depended on stable temperatures, oxygen levels, and water chemistry. Any disruption would ripple outward. A reef bleached by heat or poisoned by changing chemistry could not recover quickly. An ammonite population dwindling would unbalance food chains. The seas seemed eternal to those who lived in them, but from our vantage point, we see a system balanced precariously, soon to collapse. Speculation lets us imagine the soundscape of these oceans. The clicking of ammonite jaws, the rasp of trilobites across stone, the faint rush of schools of fish moving in unison. Light would dance on shells, shadows would ripple across reefs, and predators would strike from the gloom. It was a world both alien and strangely familiar, proof that long before us, Earth had already perfected beauty in forms now forgotten. The late Permian Earth was a patchwork of habitats, each brimming with distinct voices. On land, herds of dicynodonts grazed in rhythmic motion, their tusked jaws tearing through hardy plants. Predators like gorgonopsids stalked with patient silence, waiting for the perfect strike. Smaller cynodonts scurried in burrows, their keen senses alert to danger, while amphibians croaked in wetlands, their calls carrying over still waters. Layered above this chorus came the ceaseless buzzing of insects, dragonflies swooping with translucent wings that caught the sun. The land was noisy, restless, filled with signs of life. In the oceans, the harmony was different, quieter, but no less intense. Ammonites drifted in spiraling grace, their shells glinting in the filtered light. Trilobites marched across the seafloor, their armored bodies tracing lines in the sediment. Brachiopods and crinoids swayed gently, living metronomes marking the pulse of ancient seas. Predatory fish sliced through shoals, their movements sudden flashes of silver and shadow. If you could listen beneath the waves, you might hear the snap of jaws, the rasp of movement over stone, the deep rhythm of life at sea. Together, these habitats formed a world that seemed indestructible. Forests anchored the land, reefs anchored the seas. Predators and prey balanced each other, and cycles of life spun without pause. It was a world built on abundance, on the sense that tomorrow would echo today, that life's music would never stop. To the creatures alive then, extinction was unimaginable. They had no knowledge of endings, only of the eternal present. And yet, fragility lingered in the details. The forests depended on rainfall tied to Pangaea's geography. Insects thrived because oxygen levels were high. Reefs flourished because oceans remained within narrow chemical tolerances. Remove one condition, shift one balance, and the web would unravel. For all their grandeur, these ecosystems were delicate, as vulnerable as a glass vessel balanced on stone. To us, looking back, it feels inevitable that change was coming. To them, it was invisible. Speculation lets us step into that final age with all senses open. Imagine walking through a Permian swamp at dusk. Dragonflies whir overhead, dicynodonts wade into shallow water, and the croak of amphibians reverberates. Beyond the trees, a gorgonopsid silhouette lingers, amber eyes catching fading light. Now imagine diving into the sea beside a reef. Ammonites drift in slow spirals, fish scatter in glittering schools, and trilobites scuttle in endless ranks. It is a planet alive in every corner, rich, vibrant, confident in its permanence. But permanence is the illusion. All of these creatures, all of these systems, stood on the brink of erasure. The great dying was approaching, a wave of silence that would strip forests, empty seas, and topple lineages that had endured for hundreds of millions of years. These voices, the croaks, the buzzing wings, the clicking shells, would soon vanish, leaving only faint impressions in stone. This was the lost world, beautiful, balanced, unaware of its own fragility, a living symphony, poised for silence. The story of the great dying did not begin with sudden silence. Long before ecosystems collapsed entirely, the Earth was already showing signs of strain. Fossil records from the late Permian tell of a gradual unraveling, gaps where once there had been abundance declines in species variety, and subtle shifts in climate that pressed life into uncomfortable corners. To us, these signs are stark in hindsight. To the creatures alive then, they may have been whispers, faint warnings carried on the wind and water. One clue comes from fossil gaps. In earlier Permian strata, fossils crowd the record, diverse synapsids, thriving plants, and teeming marine life. Yet as the timeline approaches the boundary, richness declines. Entire groups of organisms thin out. Their once abundant remains dwindling to rare appearances. Paleontologists call these decline layers, intervals where ecosystems weaken before collapse. It is as if Earth's symphony faltered, instruments dropping out one by one until only fragments of melody remained. Plant life also shifted in unsettling ways. Glossopteris forests, once dominant across Gondwana, began to retract. Their leaves, preserved as fossils, appear less frequently and in narrower ranges. Pollen analysis reveals sudden drops in diversity, suggesting ecosystems lost resilience. Hardy conifers spread into regions once ruled by lush coal forests, hinting at drying climates and harsher conditions. These shifts would have rippled outward, for plants anchor the food web. As forests faltered, herbivores faced scarcity, and predators followed them into decline. Climate swings deepened the strain. Sediment layers reveal alternating signs of drought and flood, pointing to unstable weather patterns across Pangaea. Periods of intense aridity left deserts expanding, while sudden monsoons scoured the land with destructive floods. Life depends on rhythms, the predictability of seasons, the reliability of rainfall. When those rhythms waver, ecosystems lose their footing. For species finely tuned to particular environments, even subtle shifts could mean extinction. In the oceans, too, the whispers of doom grew louder. Fossil reefs show evidence of stress, shrinking in size and diversity even before the final collapse. Certain groups of brachiopods and corals decline dramatically, leaving once rich seafloors sparse. Geochemical signatures in sediments suggest fluctuations in oxygen levels, foreshadowing the anoxia that would later sweep through the seas. It is tempting to picture ammonites drifting through waters already beginning to sour, their spiraled shells reflecting light while currents carried silent threats. Speculation beckons us closer. Did the creatures themselves sense the change? Herds of dicynodonts, migrating farther than before, chasing greener valleys. Predators finding their hunts harder, their prey less abundant. Amphibians croaking in wetlands that shrank each season, their voices thinning as habitats dried. Insects adapting with strange new forms, some prospering briefly in niches created by instability, others vanishing altogether. Perhaps the world felt unsettled, not yet destroyed, but uneasy, as though something vast and unseen had shifted. To the inhabitants of that age, tomorrow must have felt like today, even as decline crept closer. But, in stone, the record is clear. Abundance was slipping away. Life was still vibrant, but its balance had begun to tilt. The whispers of doom were growing louder, though the final chord of silence had yet to fall. The late Permian was a world still alive, but its fabric was fraying. One of the most telling signs lies in the decline of biodiversity across both land and sea. Species that had once been widespread grew restricted to smaller ranges. Predator-prey relationships, once stable, began to wobble as food chains thinned. Paleontologists describe these shifts not as abrupt endings, but as tapering lines, each genus flickering out at different times. The picture is not of a sudden catastrophe striking a flourishing world, but of an ecosystem already bruised, weakened before the final blow. Microscopic evidence supports this picture. Pollen and spores, the fingerprints of ancient vegetation, show abrupt turnovers. Where once there had been a variety of plant producers, records narrow to a handful of hardy survivors. This suggests that ecosystems were losing resilience, a biological equivalent of a note struck off-key, echoing through the food web. Fewer plants meant fewer herbivores. Fewer herbivores meant predators weakened. The cascade had begun, subtle but unstoppable. In marine environments, similar stories emerge. Sedimentary layers show periodic anoxia, episodes when oxygen dropped low enough to suffocate marine life. These were not global yet, but regional, leaving patches of the ocean barren. Creatures sensitive to oxygen changes dwindled first. Fossilized reefs vanish in places long before the final extinction pulse, leaving behind evidence of decay. Some scientists even argue these smaller collapses were foreshocks, the planet rehearsing the devastation to come. The ocean was whispering its warning, though no ear was there to listen. Climate instability sharpened the edges of this decline. Geological data point to carbon isotope fluctuations, signs of shifting atmospheric chemistry. These swings hint at pulses of volcanic activity and greenhouse gases, stressing ecosystems with sudden warming and acidification. Imagine forests that once grew steadily, now struggling under skies hotter each season, their soils drying, their rivers vanishing. Imagine seas that once carried gentle currents, now warming too quickly, forcing creatures to adapt or perish. Such instability left life with no time to adjust, the tempo of change too fast for evolution to match. Speculation allows us to imagine what this meant for the daily existence of creatures alive then. Did a herd of dicynodonts notice their migration routes shrinking, rivers running lower than memory allowed? Did predators like gorgonopsids find themselves ranging farther, hungrier, their hunts no longer reliable? Did ammonites drifting through oceans follow invisible gradients of chemistry, unknowingly fleeing regions where oxygen vanished? These behaviors, if they happened, left no fossil record, yet they are consistent with the pressures we can infer. Life may have felt unsettled, restless, uneasy, in ways we can only guess. The whispers of doom were not silence, but change. They were forests faltering, reefs thinning, climates shifting, and migrations growing longer. They were the small extinctions that rarely make headlines in stone, but together told a story of ecosystems in retreat. To the living, these changes may have felt survivable, but from our perspective, they were the opening notes of catastrophe, a slow-motion unraveling that foreshadowed the greatest die-off in Earth's history. The stage was set. Pangaea, immense and unified, held life in fragile patterns tied to rain and oxygen. The seas, vast and sluggish, carried within them seeds of instability. The whispers had become a murmur. Soon the murmur would swell into a roar, a planetary crisis that would leave the Earth nearly empty. When paleontologists trace the roots of the great dying, their search returns again and again to a scar in Earth's crust, the Siberian Traps. Today, it lies as a plateau of dark basalt stretching across northern Russia. To walk there now is to see layers of ancient lava frozen in time, stacked like pages of a book. But 252 million years ago, this was not quiet stone, it was fire incarnate, a planetary wound pouring out magma in volumes beyond comprehension. The eruptions that built the Siberian Traps were not the kind we imagine from a single mountain peak. They were flood basalts where fissures split the crust and lava gushed across the land in waves, hundreds of feet thick. This was not a brief eruption measured in days or weeks. It lasted hundreds of thousands of years, erupting again and again, each episode covering vast areas in molten rock. In total, the Siberian Traps released over 3 million cubic kilometers of lava, enough to bury the entire United States under a kilometer of stone. The scale boggles the mind. Imagine standing anywhere within reach of these eruptions. The air choked with ash, the horizon glowing red, the ground trembling with ceaseless rumbling. Rivers of lava flowed for miles, consuming forests, swamps, and rivers. Entire ecosystems disappeared under black stone, leaving no trace but carbonized remains buried in basalt. For creatures nearby, survival was impossible. For the planet, the effects were catastrophic. The eruptions released more than lava. Volatile gases, carbon dioxide, sulfur dioxide, methane from coal seams ignited by magma, poured into the atmosphere. Each pulse of eruption altered the chemistry of air and sea. Sulfur aerosols reflected sunlight, plunging regions into cold darkness, while carbon dioxide built up over centuries, trapping heat in a runaway greenhouse. Rain fell as sulfuric acid, burning leaves, poisoning soils, and etching stone. The earth was caught in a cycle of fire and suffocation. Geological evidence preserves these events. Layers of basalt interbedded with ash show repeated pulses of eruption. Carbon isotope data reveal dramatic shifts, markers of vast amounts of carbon flooding the system. Mercury anomalies in sediments match volcanic emissions, like fingerprints of eruption in stone. Across the world, these signatures align with the extinction boundary, suggesting the Siberian traps were not local tragedy but global force. Speculation sharpens the picture. Could volcanism alone have destroyed over 90% of life? Some scientists argue yes. The gases alone were sufficient to alter climate and chemistry on a deadly scale. Others suggest volcanism triggered a cascade, warming oceans, released methane, oxygen collapsed, ecosystems starved. Whatever the mechanism, the eruptions were the spark, perhaps the inferno that set the planet on fire. The Siberian traps were more than rivers of lava. They were a planetary factory of poison. Each eruption belched colossal amounts of carbon dioxide into the air, pushing greenhouse levels far beyond what ecosystems could tolerate. Over tens of thousands of years, the atmosphere thickened with heat-trapping gas. Temperatures rose globally by as much as 10 degrees C, an increase not seen in any other extinction event. Forests wilted, deserts expanded, and polar regions, once cool, grew unrecognizably hot. Life, tuned to narrower climates, found itself under siege. Alongside carbon came sulfur dioxide, a gas with the power to transform skies. In the short term, sulfur aerosols dimmed the sun, cloaking Earth in a volcanic twilight. Crops of ancient forests failed, photosynthesis faltered, but sulfuric particles fell quickly, raining acid onto soils and waters. Leaves burned, rivers turned corrosive, and shallow seas became chemical traps. Organisms already weakened by climate instability now faced another assault, one that scorched the very fabric of their habitats. Coal beds buried in Siberia added to the devastation. As magma forced its way upward, it ignited these carbon-rich layers, releasing methane and additional CO2 in titanic quantities. Methane, more potent than carbon dioxide, supercharged the greenhouse effect. This release may have triggered a feedback loop. Warming oceans destabilized methane hydrates on the seafloor, which in turn vented more methane, amplifying the crisis. The Earth, once resilient, now spiraled into runaway change. Geologists can see the fingerprints of these processes in stone. Isotope records reveal sharp drops in carbon-13, consistent with massive releases of volcanic and methane carbon. Layers of clay and ash, rich in mercury, trace the timing of volcanic pulses. Across continents, sediments show evidence of acid rain, soils leached of nutrients, forests replaced by opportunistic plants. These clues, scattered across the globe, converge on Siberia as the epicenter of catastrophe. For creatures alive then, the skies must have been alien. Imagine herds of dicynodonts raising their tusked heads to see a horizon glowing red, clouds tinged yellow by sulfur, rain hissing as it struck leaves. Imagine oceans steaming with warmth, reefs paling under acidic currents, fish drifting sluggishly in waters starved of oxygen. To them, the world did not die in silence, but in a prolonged fever, a burning that offered no escape. Speculation invites us to wonder whether this firestorm alone could erase 9 out of 10 species. Some researchers argue that it could, pointing to parallels in smaller flood basalt events that caused lesser extinctions. Others suggest the volcanism was only the beginning, the spark that set off methane release, ocean stagnation, and global anoxia. Either way, the Siberian traps were central, the beating heart of destruction. It was as though Earth's crust itself conspired against life, bleeding fire and gas until the planet choked. The Siberian traps did not burn for a day or a year. They burned for centuries upon centuries. Each eruption blanketed the land in lava, then paused, only to awaken again. These pulses stretched across hundreds of thousands of years, ensuring that ecosystems never had time to recover. Forests consumed in one wave might regrow slightly, only to be buried or poisoned by the next. Species that survived an eruption faced a poisoned atmosphere, altered climate, or collapsing food webs. It was not one disaster, but an era of disasters, relentless and compounding. One of the most devastating legacies of these eruptions was their impact on the oceans. As carbon dioxide levels soared, global warming accelerated, warm waters hold less oxygen, and circulation slowed across Panthalassa, the superocean encircling Pangaea. In time, vast swaths of the ocean grew anoxic. Stripped of oxygen entirely, fossil evidence shows black shale deposits rich in organic matter, markers of lifeless seas where decay could not complete. Marine life suffocated, from tiny plankton to mighty reefs, leaving only microbes that thrived in poisonous conditions. Worse still, some scientists believe these anoxic waters released hydrogen sulfide, a deadly gas. If concentrations built high enough, it could have bubbled into the atmosphere, killing plants and animals on land and tinting skies with a greenish haze. Hydrogen sulfide also destroys ozone, leaving Earth vulnerable to ultraviolet radiation. Imagine a world where skies burned with strange colors, rains carried acid, seas exhaled poison, and sunlight pierced the weakened shield to scorch the surface. It was a convergence of terrors, each feeding the next. Geochemical signatures across the extinction boundary align with this scenario. Spikes of sulfur, abrupt losses of oxygen indicators, and isotopic shifts reveal cascades of catastrophe. In South China, South Africa, and even distant Greenland, rocks record the same story. Volcanic fingerprints everywhere, woven into the very strata. No corner of the globe escaped Siberia's wrath. The traps were not a local event. They were a planetary trauma. Speculation helps us imagine the lived reality of creatures caught in this inferno. In forests, plants blackened from acid rains, their leaves dissolving under chemical assault. Grazers starved as vegetation failed, their bones left in drying riverbeds. Predators, deprived of prey, prowled longer distances, their dominance hollow. In the seas, ammonites drifted lifelessly, their coiled shells sinking to black mud. Trilobites, survivors of ages past, dwindled into oblivion. Even microbes shifted, blooming in poisonous conditions that smothered higher life. To live in this world was to breathe uncertainty, to eat scarcity, to endure a sky that seemed to turn against you. The Siberian traps burned not only land, but the illusion of permanence. Life had thrived for millions of years, evolving in abundance, adapting to Pangaea's extremes. But when Earth's crust bled fire on such a scale, no adaptation was enough. The eruptions ensured the great dying would not be a moment, but a drawn-out catastrophe, grinding away resilience until silence spread across the planet. In the end, the Siberian traps were less an eruption than a transformation, a reshaping of Earth itself. Over the course of their fury, lava floods covered an area larger than modern Europe. Basalt sheets, piled kilometers thick, layer upon layer of fire turned to stone. Even today, these frozen flows stand as monuments, silent reminders of the time when the planet bled molten rock for hundreds of thousands of years. But their true legacy was not in the stone they left behind, but in the world they destroyed. The skies above must have seemed apocalyptic. Ash clouds dimmed sunlight for years at a time, painting days in twilight hues and nights in deeper darkness. Acid rains fell without mercy, hissing as they struck soil and water. Forests shriveled. Rivers carried chemical scars. Between pulses of eruption, the air grew hotter, thicker, suffused with greenhouse gases that trapped heat like a suffocating blanket. Earth swung between brief volcanic winters and relentless hothouse summers, each cycle eroding the will of life to endure. For creatures that survived one phase, another awaited. Grazers weakened by dwindling plants faced predators equally desperate. Predators themselves, deprived of prey, starved in turn. In the oceans, coral-like reefs collapsed, brachiopods dwindled, trilobites vanished, and ammonites clung to existence by fragile threads. Microbial mats spread across anoxic seafloors, signs of ecosystems reduced to their simplest forms. The seas, once rich with life, became tombs. On land, once thriving forests gave way to wastelands of scrub, then to deserts. The earth itself seemed to gasp, caught between fire and suffocation. Scientists still debate whether volcanism alone was enough to kill 9 out of 10 species. Perhaps the eruptions triggered a chain reaction, methane hydrates destabilizing, oceans stagnating, hydrogen sulfide bubbling into the air, or perhaps the eruptions themselves, sustained and colossal, were sufficient. Either way, the Siberian traps were the heart of the catastrophe, the ignition point of Earth's greatest dying. They remind us that the crust beneath our feet is not passive, but alive with forces vast enough to alter the trajectory of life itself. Speculation lets us pause here. In imagination, picture the horizon glowing crimson for generations, the air acrid with smoke, the land smoldering under endless flows. Imagine seas steaming with warmth, their colors shifting to sickly greens and purples as microbes thrived where animals perished. Imagine silence spreading, broken only by the hiss rain, the crack of lava, the groan of forests falling. Earth was choking on its own breath, darkened beneath poisoned skies, suffocating under the weight of its own fire. This was the world forged by the Siberian traps, a planet on fire, a biosphere unraveling, a silence approaching. It was the crucible in which the great dying began, and the scar it left still lies written in stone. If the Siberian traps were the spark, then the oceans became the chamber where Earth's crisis deepened. As volcanic gases warmed the atmosphere, the seas responded in ways both predictable and terrifying. Warm water holds less oxygen, and circulation patterns across the vast Antalasa superocean began to falter. What once had been living seas, rich with fish, ammonites, and reefs, began to turn stagnant. Oxygen collapsed, and in its absence, only the simplest and most sinister life remained. This phenomenon, anoxia, transformed vast portions of the ocean into dead zones. Fossil evidence paints a chilling picture: black shales deposited across ancient seafloors, rich in unbroken organic matter, signs that decay had stalled because no oxygen was there to fuel it. Entire ecosystems suffocated, fish drifted listlessly, ammonites faltered, and reef communities collapsed into silence. Creatures adapted to oxygen-rich currents suddenly found themselves adrift in seas that could no longer support them. But anoxia carried a darker companion. In oxygen-starved waters, microbes that thrive in the absence of oxygen took over, releasing hydrogen sulfide, a gas toxic to almost all higher life. Some scientists believe that hydrogen sulfide built up in such vast quantities that it eventually escaped into the atmosphere. If this theory holds, then Earth's skies themselves turned poisonous. Winds carried the invisible toxin across continents, poisoning plants, suffocating animals, and thinning the ozone layer above. The surface world would have been struck by ultraviolet radiation as never before, a silent killer raining down alongside toxic air. Meanwhile, deep within the oceans, another crisis was brewing. Methane hydrates, frozen reserves of methane trapped in sediments, destabilized as waters warm. Methane is a greenhouse gas, dozens of times more potent than carbon dioxide in the short term. Its release would have supercharged global warming, creating feedback loops that accelerated collapse. Warmer seas released methane, methane trapped more heat, and warmer seas released even more, a vicious spiral with no easy escape. In this runaway system, Earth became both furnace and poisoner. The imagery is haunting. Imagine once clear waters turning murky green with blooms of bacteria feeding on decay. Imagine waves rolling onto coasts, not with life, but with chemical stench. Imagine skies hazed with toxins, the air tinged yellow and sickly. For creatures breathing in those moments, whether synapsids on land or ammonites at sea, every breath carried risk. Food webs thinned, prey grew scarce, and predators faltered in hunger. It was not a sudden blow, but a tightening vice. life squeezed from every direction. Scientists tread carefully in assigning blame. Some argue volcanism alone could have driven extinction. Others suggest that without these secondary triggers, methane, anoxia, hydrogen sulfide, life might have endured. Yet the evidence aligns with catastrophe layered upon catastrophe. Earth's systems, once stable, cascaded into collapse, each feedback amplifying the next. It was not one disaster, but many, intertwined, choking the planet in waves. The oceans of the late Permian became crucibles of poison. As anoxia spread, microbes that thrived without oxygen bloomed across the seas. Instead of supporting corals, fish, and invertebrates, these waters turned into bacterial factories. Some produced methane, others released hydrogen sulfide, and together they transformed once blue waters into swirls of green, purple, and black. To stand on a Permian shore would have been to gaze at seas alien to our imagination, waters alive with color, yet deadly in essence. As hydrogen sulfide seeped into the atmosphere, the consequences for land were profound. Plants withered as their leaves were scorched by toxins. Herbivores that depended on those plants starved, their populations dwindling, leaving predators desperate and weakened. The poison carried invisibly in the wind, a killer without warning, affecting creatures across continents. Meanwhile, the thinning of the ozone layer exposed Earth to ultraviolet radiation. Forest canopies that once thrived under protective skies began to falter. Seeds and spores vulnerable to radiation declined sharply in diversity, a collapse visible even in the fossil record of pollen. Amid this ecological unraveling, methane release added yet another layer of catastrophe. As the seafloor warmed, frozen methane hydrates destabilized, venting bubbles of gas into the ocean and sky. The process may have been explosive in places, with plumes erupting like underwater geysers. Once in the atmosphere, methane acted as a supercharged greenhouse gas, trapping heat far more effectively than carbon dioxide. The planet warmed further, accelerating the very processes that released even more methane. It was a feedback loop, spiraling out of control, fire feeding fire, collapse breeding collapse. Mainstream science acknowledges these processes with caution, supported by isotopic evidence and sediment records. Carbon isotope shifts at the extinction boundary suggest an influx of lighter carbon consistent with methane release. Layers rich in sulfur compounds hint at widespread microbial activity, but speculation dares to paint the fuller picture: an Earth where seas stank of sulfur, skies shimmered with haze, and entire regions became death zones. While scientists hesitate to describe the exact scale, the possibility remains chilling that life's greatest extinction was not only volcanic, but chemical, a planetary poisoning on a staggering level. What would it have been like to live through this? Perhaps synapsids grazing by a shrinking river felt the air grow heavy, their breath labored as toxins filled their lungs. Perhaps predators hunting along coasts found prey fewer each season, seas offering only rotting carcasses washed ashore. Perhaps insects that once thrived in abundance faltered, their buzzing silenced by air too hostile for fragile wings. To them, it was not geology or chemistry, but hunger, weakness, and sickness that marked their days. The catastrophe was lived in the body before it was written in stone. And so, the earth became both executioner and prisoner, poisoned by its own oceans, scorched by its own skies, warmed by its own gases. The whisper of decline had become a roar, a convergence of deadly forces pressing life toward its edge. As the cascade of catastrophes unfolded, Earth entered a period that must have felt like endless suffocation. The oceans, once teeming with ammonites, brachiopods, and trilobites, became vast reservoirs of stagnation. Instead of sparkling blue, they turned green with microbial blooms. Then black as decay overwhelmed their depths. With little oxygen, marine life gasped and perished. Coral-like reefs dissolved into rubble, and the great food webs of the sea collapsed into silence. What remained were microbes flourishing in death, painting the water in sickly hues that no eye today has ever seen. On land, the skies bore witness to the planet's decline. Hydrogen sulfide rising from the oceans mingled with volcanic gases already thick in the air. Haze dimmed the sun, while ultraviolet radiation pierced through a weakened ozone layer. Forests shrank under the dual assault of poisoned air and brutal heat. Plants that had anchored ecosystems for millions of years disappeared almost overnight, replaced by opportunistic species struggling in damaged soils. For herbivores, each mouthful of greenery grew harder to find. For predators, each chase brought only exhaustion. Life was unraveling from both the bottom and the top of the food chain. Speculation pushes the picture further. Imagine walking across a Permian plain in those final centuries. The ground is cracked, rivers shallow, the horizon blurred by haze. The air carries a faint, acrid sting, burning lungs with each breath. Where once there had been herds, only stragglers remain, their bones, sun-bleached, litter dry gullies. Forests that once echoed with insects now stand silent, their canopies scorched. Even the nights bring no relief. The air stays hot, heavy with gases. Stars dim behind a veil of pollution. Existence itself feels tenuous, fragile, threatened on every side. Mainstream caution reminds us that not all these details are proven. Some scientists argue that hydrogen sulfide may never have reached the atmosphere in lethal quantities, or that methane release played a smaller role than volcanism alone. Yet the evidence, black shales, isotope anomalies, fossil pollen crashes, suggests that oceans, air, and climate were all shifting in ways deadly to complex life. Whether by volcanic gases alone or by cascading chemical reactions, the biosphere faced conditions it could not endure, and so the world slipped towards silence. The seas were poisoned, the skies corrupted, the land stripped of food and shelter. Each factor, methane warming, oxygen collapse, hydrogen sulfide poisoning, might have been survivable on its own. Together they were insurmountable. Earth had become a trap of its own making, a stage where nearly every player vanished. In this darkness, the stage was set for the Great Dying. Soon, more than 90% of species would vanish, leaving behind only whispers in stone. The oceans had turned against their creatures, the skies against their forests, the land against its grazer. The age of abundance had ended. Extinction had arrived. The moment arrived not with a single strike, but with a cascade that reached every corner of the planet. What had been whispers of decline became a roar of extinction. The Great Dying, Earth's most severe mass extinction, swept across land and sea, erasing nearly all that had lived. In its wake, silence stretched farther than life had ever known. The oceans were the first to fall. Anoxia spread through Panthalassa and Tethys like a tide of death. Coral-like reefs, once vibrant ecosystems built by rugose and tabulate corals, collapsed entirely. For hundreds of millions of years, reefs had served as cradles of marine diversity. In the Great Dying, they vanished. Fossil evidence shows a reef gap lasting millions of years, an absence so complete it reads like a wound in Earth's memory. Trilobites, survivors of earlier upheavals, disappeared forever. Brachiopods dwindled to remnants. Ammonites, those coiled wonders of the deep, barely scraped by, their once vast diversity cut to a fragile few. More than 90% of marine species were gone, the oceans emptied of their chorus. On land, the collapse was no less devastating. Forests shriveled under poisoned skies, and parched climates. Glossopteris trees, once spanning continents, fell silent. Conifers retreated, ferns faltered, and landscapes turned barren without plant cover. Soils eroded, rivers ran clogged with silt, and habitats unraveled. The sound of buzzing insects thinned, replaced by eerie quiet. Grazing dicynodons, once the dominant herbivores of Pangaea, were decimated. Predators like gorgonopsids, without prey, followed them into extinction. The land, once noisy with life, became a hollow expanse of dust, bones, and silence. To imagine the soundscape of this extinction is chilling. Where reefs once crackled with the activity of invertebrates, only the hum of microbial mats remained. Where forests once echoed with amphibian croaks and insect drones, Winds rushed through empty canopy. Predators that once roared or hissed now left only silence in their absence. The world became a quieter place, not peaceful, but emptied, haunted by what was missing. Speculation deepens the grief. How many lineages vanished without leaving fossils? Paleontology captures fragments, but whole histories may have been erased. Perhaps amphibians with unique adaptations disappeared unseen. Perhaps insects with strange forms, wings patterned like stained glass, colors unlike anything today, flickered into being only to vanish. Perhaps small reptiles or synapsids lived briefly in corners of Pangaea, their bones never fossilized, their stories lost. Extinction does not only erase bodies, it erases possibilities, futures that will never be known. The Great Dying was not a single instant, but an extended catastrophe. Over tens of thousands of years, waves of loss spread, each generation finding its world thinner, quieter, harsher. To live then was to witness absence grow, fewer herds, fewer calls, fewer shadows in the water. Life did not simply die, it dwindled, faltered, and disappeared into silence. The silence of the Great Dying was not uniform. It spread unevenly, creeping into valleys, seas, and skies in waves. Some regions may have clung to life for centuries before succumbing, while others collapsed swiftly, leaving barren landscape. The patchwork of decline created a world of contrasts, isolated refuges of survival surrounded by wastelands of death. Yet, over time, the silence became near total, an emptiness that stretched across continents and oceans alike. On land, deserts expanded with frightening speed. Without forests to anchor soils, winds carried dust in storms that swept across Pangaea. Where lush canopies once stood, scrub and bare ground replaced them. Synapsids that had grazed on abundant vegetation now starved, their bones scattered in dry riverbeds. Predator lineages, like the Gorgonopsids, dwindled one by one, their saber teeth no longer a symbol of dominance, but relics of a vanished world. Even insects, once abundant and resilient, suffered catastrophic losses. Fossil evidence suggests their diversity crashed dramatically, an event so rare in Earth's history that it underscores the scale of collapse. The seas fared no better. Black, stagnant waters spread wider each year, suffocating marine ecosystems. Fish populations plummeted. Sharks, ammonites, and nautiloids retreated into shrinking havens. Crinoid meadows vanished, their feathery arms never to sway again in such abundance. Trilobites, once masters of adaptability, ended their 270 million year reign. Their final shells sank into the mud, marking not only the end of a lineage but the close of an era. The ocean's cradle of life became graveyards, layered in dark shales that still carry the memory of suffocation. The extinction reshaped skies as well. Forest loss and poisoned air changed atmospheric chemistry, reducing oxygen availability on land. Creatures that once thrived in high oxygen conditions now found breathing itself a challenge. Imagine synapsids struggling for air, their chests heaving as the very act of survival grew harder. Even if food could be found, each breath was thinner, more fragile, less sustaining. Life was cornered from every direction by hunger, by poison, by heat, by suffocation. Speculation allows us to fill the gaps left by stone. What vanished forms did this extinction take from us? Were there amphibians with strange calls that no longer echo? Insects with colors more vivid than any butterfly today? Reptiles whose lineages ended before they could flourish? Entire evolutionary experiments may have been erased, their traces lost to the inadequacy of preservation. Extinction is not just a loss of species, it is a loss of futures, of alternate histories that never unfolded. And so, the earth fell quiet, from reefs to deserts, from forests to rivers, from coasts to mountain ridges. The sound of abundance dwindled into echoes. The Great Dying was not merely the absence of life, it was the erasure of possibility, a planetary silence that seemed for a moment in time final. As the Great Dying deepened, the planet entered an uncanny stillness. Life had always provided texture to the earth, buzzing, croaking, splashing, grazing, calling. Now each sound grew rarer until absence defined the world. What forests remained were thin, their canopies ragged, their trunks blackened by acid rains. Where herds of dicynodonts once thundered across valleys, only a few stragglers remained, their silhouettes against a barren horizon. Predators wandered farther and farther, finding nothing but carcasses or empty ground. The silence was not sudden, it crept in, season after season, until emptiness became normal. The oceans, too, grew ghostly. In the shallows, reefs that had anchored food webs dissolved into rubble. The intricate dance of ammonites and fish dwindled into solitary survivors drifting in poisoned waters. On the seafloor, trilobites, once diverse and enduring, vanished entirely. Their absence is one of paleontology's sharpest markers of finality. Whole groups of brachiopods collapsed, leaving shells as the only testimony of their long existence. Even plankton, the unseen foundation of the food chain, faltered, starving higher life above. The seas no longer teemed, they sighed with emptiness. For survivors, existence was a daily negotiation with collapse. Small cynodonts, burrowing into soils, may have been shielded from the worst atmospheric poisons. Opportunistic species of plants, capable of growing in degraded soils, clung stubbornly to survival. Insects that adapted to scavenging may have endured in niches left behind, but these were exceptions, not the rule. To live through the great dying was to exist in a narrowed, harsher world, where every breath, every bite, every day was a fragile victory. Speculation reminds us of what fossils cannot show, the behavior of creatures at the brink. Did herds fragment into desperate wanderers, no longer bound by the safety of numbers? Did predators turn on one another when prey ran out, their dominance stripped to hunger and desperation? Did amphibians, once tied to swollen rivers and lakes, retreat into the last muddy pools, croaking weakly until their line vanished? Extinction is not only geological, it is experiential, lived moment by creatures unaware of the vast forces closing in around them. The Great Dying erased more than species, it erased lineages stretching back hundreds of millions of years. It severed evolutionary paths that might have led to forms we can only imagine: insects, amphibians, reptiles. All carried possibilities that ended in silence. Civilizations of creatures rose and fell unseen, their lives unrecorded, their futures erased. To think of this is to feel the weight of loss, not just in numbers, but in the immeasurable library of potential that was closed forever. In this planetary stillness, Earth seemed emptied of promise. It was a silence so deep that recovery would take tens of millions of years. The Great Dying was not just an extinction. It was a reset, a narrowing of the tree of life to its barest branches. What remained would have to rebuild a world almost from scratch. In the final chapters of The Great Dying, Earth stood on the edge of emptiness. Once rich forests had collapsed into scrub and desert. Rivers ran shallow, their banks littered with the bones of herbivores who could no longer find food. The once dominant gorging opsids, sleek predators that had ruled the land, dwindled into oblivion. Even the resilient dicynodont herds, once roaming in great numbers, were reduced to scattered remnants. The silence of their absence stretched across Pangaea, a reminder that dominance offers no immunity when the world itself turns hostile. The seas, too, carried only echoes of their former glory. Where reefs had once flourished, barren seafloors stretched, unbroken, coated in microbial mats. Ammonites and nautiloids, survivors for now, drifted in greatly reduced numbers, fragile in a hostile sea. Entire groups of brachiopods and corals vanished. Trilobites, creatures that had endured for over 270 million years, disappeared forever, their long story ending in silence. The ocean's cradle of life had become crypts, holding only whispers of what once had been. What makes this extinction different from smaller crises in Earth's history is the sheer scale of loss. Over 90% of marine species and 70% of terrestrial vertebrates disappeared. Ecosystems that had taken hundreds of millions of years to evolve unraveled in less than a geological instant. The biosphere was not simply wounded, it was nearly erased. For a time, the Earth teetered on the edge of becoming sterile, the continuity of complex life reduced to a handful of survivors clinging in hidden refuges. Speculation fills the voids in the fossil record. How many creatures left no trace at all? Perhaps there were amphibians with unique forms of song, or insects with iridescent colors lost before fossilization. Perhaps reptiles, experimenting with new adaptations, perished before they could diversify. Evolution is a tapestry of experiments, most erased, few preserved. The great dying ripped away whole sections of that tapestry, leaving only tatters for us to glimpse through stone. The loss is measured not just in what we know, but in what we will never know. And then came silence. Not peaceful, but hollow. The forests no longer hummed with insects. The reefs no longer echoed with clicks and currents. The land, once resonant with herds and predators, carried only the wind. It was a planet stripped bare, haunted by absence. For millions of years, recovery would be slow, tentative, fragile. But in this silence lay the seed of renewal. From the ruins of the great dying, evolution would eventually rebuild, though nothing could restore what was lost. The great dying was Earth's most profound reminder of fragility. Life had once seemed unshakable, abundant beyond imagination, only to be reduced to near emptiness. It was a planetary silence that still echoes, written into the rocks, carried in the absence of trilobites, reefs, and forests. A silence that tells us life is resilient, but never invincible. The Great Dying took place over 250 million years ago, yet we speak of it with certainty. How can we know so much about a world so ancient? The answer lies not in memory, but in stone, in the strata of Earth itself, where every layer is a page, every fossil a word, and every chemical trace a whisper of the past. To study this extinction is to learn to read a language written not with ink, but with minerals and time. Geologists call the sharp division that marks the end of the Permian and the beginning of the Triassic a boundary layer. In outcrops across the world, from China to South Africa to Greenland, this layer is unmistakable. Fossils above it differ drastically from those below. Diversity plummets in an instant of geological time. Where once there were brachiopods, corals, and trilobites, suddenly there is absence. The boundary is not just a line in stone, it is a scar, recording the greatest rupture life has ever endured. Fossils are among the clearest voices in this record. Before the boundary, the strata teem with ammonites, brachiopods, crinoids, and trilobites. After, many of these groups vanish completely. Others survive in dramatically reduced numbers. On land, synapsids and amphibians thin out, replaced by smaller, hardier forms. The richness of life shrinks visibly in the fossil record. Each absence, a line erased from Earth's diary. To hold a trilobite fossil is to touch a lineage that ended in that silence, a physical fragment of the story. Beyond fossils, chemical clues enrich the narrative. Isotope anomalies, particularly in carbon, reveal dramatic disruptions in Earth's systems. At the boundary, geologists see a sharp drop in carbon-13 relative to carbon-12. This suggests massive injections of light carbon into the atmosphere and oceans, consistent with volcanic eruptions and methane release. These isotopic fingerprints are consistent across continents, pointing to a global event, not a local disaster. Each anomaly is a signature, as though the planet itself signed its confession in stone. Sediment layers also bear witness. Black shales deposited during this period point to anoxic seas, their dark coloration a product of organic matter that never decayed. Instead of oxygen-fueled decomposition, microbial mats preserve the dead, layering ocean floors in carbon-rich mud. Elsewhere, ash beds trace volcanic pulses, while mercury concentrations match the emissions of colossal eruptions. Every rock face becomes a chapter, its minerals telling us of skies darkened, seas stagnated, and land stripped bare. Even the coal gap speaks volumes. Before the extinction, vast coal forests thrived, their remains compressed into carbon-rich seams. At the Permian-Triassic boundary, coal deposits vanish almost entirely for millions of years. This coal gap reveals the collapse of forest ecosystems, a botanical silence that endured long after the animals fell. In the absence of coal, we read the absence of forests, and in that absence, the hollowing of terrestrial life. Yet, for all this certainty, mystery lingers. The data are sharp, but their interpretation leaves room for debate. Were the Siberian traps alone sufficient? Did methane hydrates and hydrogen sulfide magnify the disaster? The evidence tells us what happened. Oceans went anoxic, diversity collapsed, forests failed, but the precise sequence remains open. The stone offers clarity and enigma in equal measure. To read the great dying in stone is to trace a story across continents. In South China, exposed cliffs reveal limestone layers rich with Permian fossils, suddenly replaced by barren Triassic stone. In South Africa's Karoo Basin, the skeletons of therapsids vanish almost at once, entire communities reduced to a handful of survivors. In Greenland and Russia, black shales mark oceans that turn toxic. Each site is a page in the same book, written in different languages of rock, but telling a single story, abundance collapsing into absence. One of the most striking aspects of this record is its universality. Unlike local extinctions caused by regional shifts, the Permian-Triassic boundary looks the same worldwide. Fossils disappear in synchrony, chemical signals repeat across oceans and continents, mercury spikes, carbon isotope shifts, sulfur anomalies, all appear in layers deposited at the same time. This universality confirms that the catastrophe was global. The Great Dying was not a local tragedy. It was an event that engulfed the planet. The details embedded in stone also reveal the tempo of extinction. Some layers suggest pulses of loss, waves of decline following volcanic activity or oceanic disruption. In other places, the fossil record appears as an abrupt break, as if life simply ended in a geological instant. The reality was likely both a long period of stress, punctuated by sudden collapses. Imagine generations of creatures living through centuries of decline, each age thinner than the last, until one final threshold tipped the balance beyond recovery. Stone captures both the gradual and the sudden, the whispers and the silence. Knowledge nuggets abound in this record. The boundary clay, a thin line of sediment separating two ages, is often less than a meter thick. It represents one of Earth's most dramatic transitions. In some locations, this clay is enriched with volcanic ash, binding it directly to the Siberian traps. Elsewhere, its chemical fingerprint points to stagnant, toxic oceans. For geologists, this line is a window stand on one side, and you see the last forests of the Permian. Step across, and you are in the wastelands of the Triassic. A single stride spans the greatest dying Earth has ever known. But while the evidence is clear, the interpretation is contested. Science thrives on caution, weighing multiple hypotheses. Some researchers argue that volcanism alone explains the collapse. Others point to cascades of methane release, hydrogen sulfide, and runaway warming. Each rock holds clues. But the puzzle remains incomplete. The certainty of data contrasts with the mystery of meaning. The great dying resists reduction to a single cause, reminding us that Earth's systems are intricate, entangled, and fragile. For the listener, imagine standing before these rocks. Imagine running your hand across a boundary layer, fingertips tracing fossils that vanish beneath them. Each mark in stone is a diary entry, written not in words, but in minerals, telling of seas that turned black, skies that rained acid, and forests that fell to silence. The Great Dying is not only an event to study, it is a reminder that Earth remembers, even when life itself nearly forgets. The rocks speak, if we learn to listen. The Great Dying erased most of life, yet it did not end the story. Amid silence and ruin, some creatures endured, carrying the fragile flame of existence into the future. They were not the giants or the rulers of their age, but the small, the hardy, the overlooked. Their survival was not glamorous, but it was decisive. Without them, Earth might never have recovered. Among the most significant survivors were the cynodonts, small, burrowing therapsids, often described as mammal-like reptiles, while their larger cousins, the mighty gorgonopsids, perished. Cynodonts endured by retreating underground. In burrows, they were shielded from poisoned air, scorching heat, and predators desperate for prey. Their small bodies needed less food, their diets more flexible. Some likely scavenged, others hunted insects, still abundant in niches left behind. In the shadows of extinction, cynodonts carried forward traits that would one day shape mammals: differentiated teeth, faster metabolisms, and perhaps even rudimentary care for their young. Their survival was not only a victory for themselves, but for every mammal that would descend from them. The dicynodonts, once dominant grazers, also clung to survival, though their herds were shattered. A handful of hardy lineages persisted. Their beaks and tusks allowed them to crop tough, sparse vegetation, while their physiology adapted to arid conditions. They did not flourish immediately, but their persistence bridged ecosystems across the void. In the early Triassic, these survivors became among the few large herbivores to repopulate landscapes, stabilizing food chains in barren worlds. It is a reminder that resilience often comes not from strength, but from flexibility and endurance. Smaller reptiles also found footholds. Lizard-like forms, though less conspicuous than their apsids, survived in niches overlooked by larger predators. Some may have been insectivores, feeding on the last thriving arthropods. Others clung to habitats along shrinking rivers or lakes. Their survival strategies mirrored those of cynodonts: small size, adaptable diets, and the ability to exploit microhabitats. These reptiles were not dominant, but they were present, and presence was all survival required. The oceans, though devastated, were not wholly barren. Microbial mats spread widely across seafloors, thriving where oxygen was absent and higher life had perished. While these mats represented collapse to us, they were survival to microbes. In shallow waters, some bivalves and gastropods persisted, opportunists that fed where others could not. A few lineages of ammonites and nautiloids endured, fragile but not extinguished. These small survivors became the seeds from which the oceans would one day recover, though it would take millions of years. Plants, too, had their survivors. Opportunistic species, such as ferns, rebounded quickly. Their spores adapted to disturbed soils. This fern spike, seen in the fossil record, marks the first regrowth after forests collapsed. Hardy gymnosperms, able to withstand arid conditions, also clung on. While diversity plummeted, these survivors stabilized soils, slowed erosion, and gradually rebuilt habitats. From these humble beginnings, new forests would eventually rise. Speculation sharpens the image. Did survival come by adaptation, by chance, or both? Some traits clearly helped: burrows, small size, flexible diets. Yet luck played its part. A burrow in the right soil, a plant patch near a dwindling stream, a population just far enough from poisoned seas. Survival was often circumstantial. The giants vanished, but the humble endured, shaping the world that came after. In the barren aftermath of the Great Dying, Earth resembled a broken stage. The mighty actors had exited, leaving emptiness in their place. Yet in the wings, the survivors emerged, not in triumph, but in quiet persistence. Their world was not abundant. It was stripped and hostile, but even in scarcity, they found ways to endure. For the cynodonts, survival was a matter of shrinking their lives to fit a shrunken world. Their burrows shielded them from the worst of surface extremes: searing days, freezing nights, and poisoned skies. Underground, the soil provided insulation, moisture, and refuge. Fossil burrow networks suggest some cynodonts lived communally, sharing tunnels that buffered them from environmental swings. Their small size reduced food demands, and their varied teeth allowed them to chew different foods: insects, roots, carrion. These adaptations were not extraordinary in appearance, but they were extraordinary in resilience. While larger creatures vanished, the cynodonts endured, carrying within them the blueprint of mammals yet to come. The dicynodonts, reduced from vast herds to scattered remnants, survived by enduring hunger. Their beaked jaws could shear through dry, fibrous plants that few others could eat. Their physiology, possibly allowing them to tolerate dehydration and heat stress, made them suited for harsher climates. Fossil evidence shows that some dicynodonts grew smaller in the Triassic, a likely response to resource scarcity. In their persistence, they became vital bridges, stabilizing plant-animal interactions in a devastated world. Without them, recovery on land may have been even slower. Small reptiles likewise found footholds in neglected corners. Their agility allowed them to exploit microhabitats, cracks in rocks, margins of streams, or even scavenged remains left behind by the collapse. They were opportunists, surviving not because they dominated, but because they adapted quickly to niches others could not fill. Some lineages would eventually give rise to early archosaurs, the ancestors of crocodiles and dinosaurs. In their humble survival, the seeds of future dominions were planted. Insects, though reduced, were never wholly extinguished. Beetles, hardy and adaptable, persisted where other insect groups failed. Their ability to consume decaying material gave them an advantage in a world littered with death. They scavenged what remained, recycling nutrients back into soils and helping the slow return of plants. The sound of their wings may have been among the few that still carried through the empty forests, a faint buzz in the silence, marking continuity when so much else had ended. The oceans, though devastated, also clung to life in unlikely forms. Microbial mats spreading across anoxic seafloors seemed like regression, a return to simpler ecosystems. Yet in their growth, they preserved Earth's continuity. Some mollusks and small bivalves endured in shallow waters, feeding in niches, abandoned by greater creatures. A handful of ammonites survived, reduced in variety, but not extinguished. These remnants became fragile lifelines, carrying marine ecosystems across the extinction boundary into the Triassic. Plants, too, played a role in quiet resilience. Ferns, opportunistic and fast-spreading, thrived in disturbed landscapes. Their fern spike in the fossil record signals their dominance after forests collapsed. They may have been the first green recovery the survivors saw, spores filling the air, carpets of ferns reclaiming burned and barren ground. Gymnosperms, though diminished, also held on, anchoring soils and giving structure to ecosystems waiting for renewal. Speculation invites us to wonder, did survivors know in their own way that they were remnants of a lost world? Did cynodonts scurry above ground to landscapes they no longer recognized? Did dicynodonts wander across plains, remembering the herds that were gone? Survival was not glory, it was endurance, small lives clinging in shadows, unseen yet vital. The survivors of the great dying were more than relics, they were architects of the world that followed. In their persistence lay the foundation of the Triassic, and eventually the rise of entirely new ecosystems. Their strategies, modest, quiet, often invisible, shaped the course of life for millions of years. While the giants of the Permian perished, these small resilient forms ensured that Earth's story continued. The cynodonts exemplify this role. Though reduced in number, their traits prepared them for expansion once conditions stabilized. Their differentiated teeth allowed them to specialize in varied diets, and their likely warm-blooded physiology gave them energy to adapt to fluctuating climates. Over time, some evolved into creatures more recognizably mammalian. The roots of our own existence trace back to their survival in burrows and shadows. Without these small synapsids, enduring the darkest age, mammals might never have risen. The dicynodonts, too, carried the legacy of herbivory across the boundary. Their ability to crop hardy vegetation helped anchor food webs when forests had collapsed. Though diminished, they became the scaffolding upon which ecosystems could rebuild. In the Triassic, some dicynodonts rebounded, growing large again, reclaiming roles as grazers. Their survival was not just persistence, but a bridge, carrying herbivory from one age to another, ensuring plants and animals remained interlinked. Small reptiles, lizards, and their kin endured in silence, but sowed the seeds of transformation. Some of their descendants diversified into early archosaurs, lineages that would give rise to dinosaurs, crocodiles, and pterosaurs. Their survival was not spectacular at the time. It was quiet, overlooked, unremarkable. Yet in hindsight, it was world-changing. The absence of dominant therapsids and gordonopsids opened ecological space, and reptiles ready to exploit it eventually flourished. Survival in the shadows created opportunity for the next rulers of Earth. Insects, though reduced, played irreplaceable roles in recovery. Beetles recycled nutrients, while other hardy groups spread into new niches. Their persistence supported regrowth of plants, pollination, and decomposition, reweaving the fabric of ecosystem strand by strand. Imagine a barren plain sprouting ferns, their spores drifting on the wind, while beetles scurried below, breaking down decaying matter. These humble cycles sustained soil and set the stage for forests to return. The oceans, too, leaned on survivors. Ammonites, though reduced to fragile remnants, would diversify again in the Triassic, filling the seas with new forms. Bivalves and gastropods, adaptable and persistent, re-established themselves in shallow water. These lineages became the building blocks of future marine ecosystems. Though microbial mats had dominated seafloors, they eventually receded as higher life reclaimed its place. The seas, once blackened with stagnation, slowly regained their pulse because a few lineages endured. Plants offered the most visible signal of recovery. The fern spike marked not only survival, but resilience, showing that even after catastrophe, green life could reclaim the earth. From these pioneers, gymnosperms re-established forests, stabilizing soils and bringing back habitats for animals. Each sprouting plant was an act of defiance against extinction, a step toward restoring the richness of ecosystems. Speculation adds a final layer. Survival was not only adaptation, but chance. A burrow in the right soil, a forest patch spared from fire, an ocean current that kept oxygen alive. Luck decided as much as biology. The Great Dying was a filter, brutal and blind, yet what slipped through became the foundation of everything to come. Survivors in the shadows carried life forward, fragile yet unbroken, ensuring Earth's story would continue. When the silence of the Great Dying began to ease, Earth did not spring back into vibrancy. Recovery was slow, halting, and incomplete. The Triassic dawned not with abundance but with scarcity. Strange, fragile ecosystem struggling to reclaim a world emptied of its richness. To walk across Pangaea in those early ages would have been to traverse landscapes alien to us, sparse and muted, haunted by absence. Forests, once sprawling and lush, returned hesitantly. Instead of towering glossopteris groves or diverse Permian canopies, the land was patched with ferns and hardy gymnosperms. These pioneers spread across barren soils, their spores carried on the wind, their roots gripping thin earth, eroded by centuries of desertification. Yet diversity was low, entire groups of plants had been erased, leaving ecosystems with little depth. The fossil record shows this vividly. For millions of years, coal deposits are absent, a coal gap symbolizing the collapse of dense forests. Earth was green again, but not whole. On land, animal life reflected this same fragility. Survivors like cynodonts and small dicynodonts carried forward, but their numbers were limited. Communities were sparse, scattered across Pangaea's vast interiors. Predator-prey relationships were unstable, food chains tenuous. Fossil assemblages from the early Triassic show ecosystems dominated by only a handful of species, repeated across wide regions. It was a monotony of survival, where opportunistic lineages thrived in a simplified world, while diversity waited for conditions to stabilize. The oceans mirrored this barrenness. Reef ecosystems, obliterated in the extinction, did not return for millions of years. In their place stretched seafloors covered with microbial mats, eerily reminiscent of Earth's earliest biosphere. Ammonites clung to existence, slowly diversifying again, but coral-like builders were gone. The reef gap of the Triassic stands as one of the most haunting voids in Earth's ecological history. What had been vibrant cities of life became wastelands of microbes and sediment. Marine ecosystems functioned, but at a diminished alien scale. The fossil record captures this strange pause. Paleontologists call it a dead zone, a period where diversity is so low that it seems life itself held its breath. Rocks preserve few species, repeated endlessly across sites, a monotony that speaks of ecological fragility. It is not silence, but a thin echo of what had been. Recovery was not measured in decades or centuries, but in millions of years. Earth, once emptied, took an age to refill. Speculation lets us imagine these landscapes. Imagine walking across plains where only ferns stretched to the horizon, no forest canopy above, no chorus of insects in the air. Imagine rivers lined with sparse vegetation, a few synapsids drinking cautiously, no great herds around them. Imagine diving into shallow seas where instead of reefs you find endless mats of microbes, green and purple under dim light, with only scattered ammonites drifting by. To us, it would feel unsettling, familiar yet incomplete, a world alive but not abundant. In the early Triassic, life's persistence was defined by opportunists. With ecosystems stripped to their bones, the few survivors that endured were free to spread into empty niches. But this dominance was less triumph than necessity. The world's communities were simplified, often dominated by one or two resilient lineages, a fragile patchwork that could collapse again with ease. On land, Lastrosaurus, a squat dicenodont herbivore, became the unlikely monarch of this barren earth. Fossil evidence shows that in some regions it made up over 90% of vertebrate remains. Herds of these tusked, beaked grazers wandered across desolate plains, feeding on tough vegetation. They were not elegant giants, but hardy survivors, able to tolerate drought and scarcity. In a way, their very mediocrity, their ability to survive on little, became the secret of their dominance. For a time, Earth was the planet of Lastrosaurus, a symbol of resilience in a diminished age. Other survivors filled smaller roles. Semidonts, burrowing mammal-like reptiles, scurried in the shadows, feeding on insects and small prey. Archosaur relatives, still small and unassuming, lingered at the edges of ecosystems, biding their time. Amphibians clung to rivers and swamps, though many lineages never returned to former abundance. Insects, reduced but not extinguished, played their quiet part in recycling nutrients and pollinating opportunistic plants. The variety was thin, but the cycle of life continued, threadbare yet unbroken. The oceans, meanwhile, were haunted realms. Coral-like reefs were absent, leaving microbial mats and sediment-covered seafloors in their place. Ammonites, reduced to a handful of lineages, began to recover, their coiled shells marking the slow return of marine diversity. Bivalves and gastropods, adaptable and hardy, also spread across shallow seas, exploiting the emptiness left by vanished groups. Yet the oceans lacked complexity. Their food webs were sparse, their structures alien compared to the vibrant reefs and communities of the Permian. They functioned, but barely, like a ghost of their former selves. The landscapes of recovery must have appeared otherworldly. Imagine walking across endless plains dominated by Lystrosaurus, their squat bodies trudging in herds where once diverse synapsids roamed. Imagine diving into shallow waters where microbial carpets stretched across the seafloor, dotted only by occasional ammonites or clams. These were ecosystems, but stripped down, simplified, reduced to their most basic form. To a visitor from the Permian, it would have felt as though life itself had been hollowed out. The fossil record captures this strangeness with striking clarity. Assemblages from South Africa, Russia, and China reveal communities dominated by a handful of species repeated across vast regions. This ecological uniformity reflects not strength, but fragility. When ecosystems are diverse, they are resilient. When dominated by few, they are vulnerable. The early Triassic was a time of vulnerability, when life endured but recovery teetered on the edge. The dead zone of fossils is not silence, but monotony, a haunting symbol of just how close Earth came to losing complexity altogether. As the Triassic unfolded, life began, slowly, cautiously, to rebuild. The early Triassic had been a wasteland dominated by opportunists. But over millions of years, cracks of diversity widened. By the Middle Triassic, ecosystems were no longer barren echoes. New players emerged, and though the world still bore scars, it began to hum again with tentative complexity. Plants were among the first to broaden the landscape. Ferns, once the pioneers of empty ground, gave way to gymnosperms that grew taller and more diverse. Conifers and cycads spread across valleys and hillsides, stitching together canopies where once there had been only scrub. These forests were not as lush as the Permian's coal swamps, but they stabilized soils, offered shade, and created new habitats. With greenery came opportunity for herbivores, and slowly food webs thickened. Among animals, the dicynodonts persisted, but waned, making room for other survivors to rise. Cynodonts diversified into new forms, some small and burrowing, others larger and more advanced, inching toward the mammalian blueprint. Meanwhile, archosaurs, once humble survivors in the Permian, began to expand. Agile and adaptable, they spread across Pangaea, experimenting with body plans that would one day produce crocodiles, pterosaurs, and dinosaurs. The silence of extinction had opened space, and these survivors stepped into it. The oceans also began their slow return to vitality. Ammonites, fragile though they were, diversified again into a dazzling array of coiled forms. Their recovery became a hallmark of the Triassic seas, a sign that life's flame was no longer flickering but growing. Bivalves spread widely, stabilizing seafloors and creating new communities. Eventually, reefs reappeared, not the coral reefs we know, but structures built by sponges and other organisms, re-establishing the complexity of marine life after millions of years of absence. From microbial mats, the oceans climbed back toward diversity. Yet, recovery was not a restoration of the old. The Triassic Earth was a changed world. The dominance of synapsids was broken. The age of reptiles was beginning. Forests were thinner, seas stranger, skies hotter. The ecosystems that arose looked alien compared to the Permian. They were built on the skeleton of loss, shaped by survivors, and infused with new experiments. The extinction had reset the rules, and evolution was playing a new game. The dead zone of the fossil record stands as a haunting pause, a reminder of how close Earth came to emptiness. But beyond it, the Triassic's slow bloom shows resilience. From the shadows, from burrows, from seafloor mats, life had endured. What followed was not a return, but a reinvention, a reshaping of Earth's biosphere into forms that would dominate for the next 50 million years. From silence came strange new music, and from ruin rose the dawn that would lead, eventually, to dinosaurs. The Great Dying was not just an ending, it was also a beginning. Though it erased more than 90% of species, it reshaped the evolutionary stage in ways that would echo through deep time. Without this mass extinction, the story of life, including our own, might have unfolded very differently. It was tragedy, on a scale almost beyond comprehension, yet it opened doors that would have remained closed had the Permian's world endured. Before the catastrophe, Earth was dominated by synapsids. Gorgonopsids ruled as apex predators. Dicynodonts grazed in massive herds, and trilobites and brachiopods filled the oceans. These lineages had persisted for millions of years, appearing almost invincible, but the Great Dying toppled them, cutting down lineages that had survived countless smaller crises. When the smoke cleared and silence stretched across the planet, the survivors were not the rulers, but the overlooked, small cynodonts, burrowing reptiles, hardy dicynodonts, and opportunistic plants. Their persistence would guide evolution into unexpected directions. The Triassic, shaped by these survivors, became a laboratory of reinvention, With ecological space emptied by extinction, survivors diversified rapidly. Cynodonts, once marginal, flourished into new forms that edged closer to true mammals. Their teeth became more specialized, their metabolisms more efficient, their behavior more complex. Without the Great Dying, mammals may have remained overshadowed by other synapsid lineages. Instead, the catastrophe cleared the field, setting the stage for our distant ancestors to matter. Reptiles, too, seized the opportunity. Archosaurs, small and inconspicuous in the Permian, spread across Pangaea in the Triassic. Freed from competition with gorgonopsids and other dominant predators, they diversified into astonishing forms. From their ranks came crocodile ancestors, soaring pterosaurs, and the earliest dinosaurs. By the late Triassic, dinosaurs had begun their rise, a dominance that would last for over 150 million years. Their reign was not inevitable. It was forged in the void left by extinction. The oceans carried similar legacies. Ammonites, nearly erased, rebounded spectacularly. Their coiled shells became symbols of marine recovery, proliferating into countless forms. Bivalves, resilient and adaptable, spread across seafloors, filling niches once dominated by brachiopods. Coral-like reefs eventually returned, built this time by different architects. In each case, the extinction did not simply prune the tree of life. It rewrote its architecture. Old lineages were cut short, and new ones branched in unexpected directions. Speculation invites us to imagine what might have been if the Great Dying had never occurred. Perhaps synapsids other than cynodonts would have continued to dominate, leaving little room for mammals to evolve. Perhaps gorgonopsids, with their saber-like teeth, would have reigned as apex predators for millions more years. Perhaps trilobites, enduring yet again, would still creep across modern seas. In such a world, dinosaurs might never have risen, mammals might never have emerged, and humans might never have appeared. Our very existence may be an indirect consequence of catastrophe, the fragile gift of survival filtered through deep time. The Great Dying, then, is both tragedy and opportunity. For ancient life, it was an apocalypse beyond imagination. For the future, it was a clearing of paths, an opening of possibilities. It reminds us that extinction is not only about loss, but also about transformation, reshaping the trajectory of evolution itself. The paradox of the Great Dying is that its devastation created space for renewal. By removing so many dominant lineages, it reset the evolutionary clock. The ecosystems that emerged in its aftermath were strange and fragile, yet they gave rise to the lineages that would one day shape the modern world. Our own existence is tied to this ancient silence. Without it, the story of life might have followed an entirely different script. For the cynodonts, the extinction was both a crucible and a chance. Their small bodies and adaptable diets allowed them to endure when larger therapsids perished. In the Triassic, they diversified, and over tens of millions of years, their descendants gave rise to mammals. Every mammal alive today, from whales in the oceans to primates in the trees, owes its existence to the survival of those humble burrowers. The path to humanity began not with triumph, but with hiding in shadows while giants fell. For the archosaurs, the void left by gorgonopsids and other predators was an open invitation. They spread rapidly, experimenting with new forms. From them came the dinosaurs, who would dominate for more than 150 million years. Dinosaurs shaped ecosystems, influenced plant evolution, and left a legacy that still echoes in the birds flying above us. The Great Dying did not guarantee their rise, but it made it possible, clearing the ecological canvas on which they painted their age of reign. In the oceans, similar transformations unfolded. Ammonites rebounded and flourished, their diversity becoming a hallmark of the Mesozoic seas. Bivalves replaced brachiopods as the dominant shellfish, a shift that continues today. Coral reefs returned in new forms, built not by the same groups as before, but by successors. The ocean's renewal was not restoration, but reinvention, a demonstration that life adapts not by recreating the past, but by inventing new futures. This extinction also carries a broader legacy. It shows how fragile resilience truly is. Earth's biosphere nearly collapsed entirely, yet it recovered through the persistence of the few. It is a reminder that survival is not always strength or dominance, but adaptability, chance, and persistence in the margins. For us, this truth is humbling. Our existence rests on a chain of survival that passed through that narrowest of bottlenecks when life itself nearly ended. Speculation deepens the wonder that different lineages survived. Perhaps the world today would look alien to us. Maybe intelligent descendants of gorgonopsids would walk the earth, or trilobite-like creatures would dominate the seas. Maybe no creatures would have developed the capacity for thought, language, or history. The Great Dying reminds us how contingent our story is, how much it rests on survival in deep time, and so its legacy is double-edged. For ancient life, it was a tragedy, the silencing of nearly everything that breathed or swam. For the future, it was an opening, a reset that allowed new lineages to rise. The dinosaurs, the mammals, and eventually humans all traced their roots to the silence that followed. The Great Dying is not only a record of loss, but also the hidden foundation of our world, a reminder that from ruin, life can begin again in forms no one could have predicted. Though the Great Dying unfolded 252 million years before the first humans, its shadow seems to touch our imagination across cultures and eras. We tell stories of fire and flood, silence and rebirth. We imagine worlds ending, only to begin again. These myths are not memories in the literal sense. No human lineage could have witnessed the Permian extinction. Yet perhaps in the way deep time echoes through geology and through us, we sense the shape of catastrophe and rebirth in our collective stories. Flood myths are among the most universal, from Mesopotamia's Epic of Gilgamesh to the biblical story of Noah, from Hindu legends of Manu to Native American tales of great waters. Cultures across the globe speak of the world drowning, of survival by a remnant, of life carried forward against impossible odds. Scientifically, these stories may arise from local floods, ice melts, or coastal shifts. Yet they resonate with the deep rhythm of life, surviving catastrophe. In them, we hear faint parallels to times when the oceans themselves turned hostile, when survival meant enduring through waters poisoned or overrun. Fire, too, is a recurring theme. Myths of cleansing fire, of skies burning, of earth remade through flame, echo across traditions. Norse mythology tells of Ragnarok, when fire giants and destruction sweep the world. Hindu cosmology speaks of cycles of creation and destruction by fire and flood. Even modern imagination returns to this imagery, from apocalyptic fiction to visions of nuclear winter. We fear fire, but we also understand it as transformation. What burns away makes space for what comes after. In this way, fire myths mirror the reality of the Siberian traps, where Earth itself led fire, reshaping life's trajectory. Silence is another haunting motif. Myths often describe not just destruction, but the quiet that follows, the stillness after storms, the emptiness of wastelands, the lonely survivors wandering across barren ground. These images echo eerily with what we know of the early Triassic dead zone, when ecosystems were stripped to monotony, when life was reduced to a handful of forms repeated endlessly. Human imagination, though unlinked in time, seems drawn to these archetypes: the silence after collapse, the waiting before renewal. Why do these themes recur? Perhaps because they reflect something fundamental in the human psyche, an awareness of fragility. Even without knowing the science, ancient people understood floods, fires, plagues, and famine. They saw how quickly abundance could turn to scarcity. To tell stories of near total destruction was to give voice to this awareness and to hold hope that renewal might follow. In this sense, myths and the Great Dying are bound not by memory, but by resonance, both reminding us that endings and beginnings are entwined. Modern literature and science fiction continue this fascination. Post-apocalyptic novels, dystopian films, and speculative worlds all circle around extinction and rebirth. From visions of ruined cities overtaken by plants to tales of humanity surviving nuclear winters or climate collapse, we revisit the pattern of devastation followed by regrowth, consciously or not. Our imagination mirrors the rhythms of deep time, repeating in fiction what has already unfolded in stone. In this way, the great dying becomes a mirror for us, not remembered, but intuited, a shape our stories return to because it is also the shape of life's history. Catastrophe, silence, survival, renewal, a cycle written first in rocks, then in myths, then in art. The echo of extinction reverberates, not only through ancient myths, but also through the stories we craft today. Literature, fantasy, and science fiction return again and again to the theme of endings. Worlds collapsing, civilizations erased, silence spreading, followed by uncertain renewal. This fascination may not stem from direct memory of events like the Great Dying, but from the shape of Earth's history itself, carried forward into our imagination. We are creatures who sense fragility, and we write it into our tales. Consider the countless depictions of global collapse in modern storytelling. In science fiction, we imagine alien invasions or asteroid impacts wiping out humanity, stories that echo the fate of species lost long before us. In dystopian fiction, we imagine environmental collapse, plagues, or nuclear fire, parallels to the volcanic winters, poisoned air, and anoxic oceans of the Permian. Even in fantasy, we return to apocalyptic themes, lands consumed by dragons' fire, worlds drowned by magic, gods who end creation only to birth it anew. These recurring motifs reveal something deeper than entertainment, a recognition that destruction and rebirth are fundamental rhythms, written both in geology and in our collective psyche. The Great Dying, in particular, resonates as a mirror for our anxieties. When we read of an Earth poisoned by its own atmosphere, of seas turned deadly, of ecosystems unraveling, it feels hauntingly familiar. In an age where climate change and environmental collapse occupy our thoughts, the echoes of the Permian seem sharper. We see in its record not only the fragility of past worlds, but the precariousness of our own. The rocks tell us it has happened before. Our imagination whispers, could it happen again? Speculation allows us to connect these threads. Perhaps myths of floods and fire, silence and rebirth, persist not because they recall any specific event, but because they reflect patterns of reality that life has always known. Catastrophes, large and small, have marked every age. Human imagination, sensitive to fragility, captures these rhythms and transforms them into narrative. Whether told in oral tradition or written in novels, the arc remains the same: collapse, silence, survival, renewal. In this, our storytelling parallels the shape of the Permian-Triassic boundary itself. The Great Dying also reminds us of the role of survivors, both in reality and in imagination. Myths often feature a remnant, a single family, a chosen few, an ark carrying seeds of the future. In deep time, these were the synodonts, the dicynodonts, the hardy plants and insects who endured. In myth. They become Noah, Manu, Deucalion, or nameless wanderers rebuilding from ashes. The archetype of survival resonates because it is the truth of life's history. The few who endure carry forward the many who do not. And so, the Great Dying becomes more than paleontology. It becomes a metaphor, a mirror, a canvas upon which human imagination projects its deepest fears and hopes. We look into the silence of 252 million years ago and see our own anxieties about the fragility of the world we inhabit. Yet we also see resilience, the persistence of life, the inevitability of renewal. In every myth, in every story of destruction and rebirth, we echo the truth written in stone. Endings are never absolute. From silence, something always rises. The Great Dying is not only a story of the distant past, it is also a mirror held up to the present. When scientists describe the Permian-Triassic extinction, the images they paint, warming climates, oceans turning anoxic, skies poisoned by gases, ecosystems unraveling, sound eerily familiar. Though we are separated from that catastrophe by more than 250 million years, Its echoes resound in our own age. The question lingers like a shadow. Are we living at the edge of another great dying? Today, Earth is experiencing profound change. Global temperatures are rising at a rate faster than any seen in human history. Oceans absorb vast amounts of carbon dioxide, becoming warmer and more acidic. Coral reefs, heirs of ecosystems lost at the Permian boundary, are bleaching and collapsing under stress. Forests are burning, insect populations are dwindling, and vertebrate species are vanishing at a pace that rivals geological mass extinctions. Scientists speak of a sixth extinction already underway, with extinction rates dozens or even hundreds of times higher than natural background levels. The parallels to the Great Dying are haunting. In the Permian, volcanic eruptions flooded the atmosphere with carbon dioxide, driving rapid global warming. Today, human industry performs the same task, releasing billions of tons of greenhouse gases each year. In the Permian, warming oceans suffocated, their circulation faltering until anoxia spread. Today, scientists measure oxygen loss in the seas, dead zones spreading in places like the Gulf of Mexico and the Arabian Sea. In the Permian, hydrogen sulfide and acid rains poisoned the land. Today, pollutants, acidification, and altered weather cycles disrupt ecosystems. Different agents, but eerily similar consequences. Yet science is careful in its comparisons. Mainstream voices emphasize that while modern changes are alarming, the Earth is not yet on the scale of the Permian apocalypse. The Siberian traps erupted for hundreds of thousands of years, dwarfing our centuries of industrial activity. The Permian saw oxygen collapse across entire oceans. While today's dead zones remain local, the fossil record of the Great Dying speaks of 90% extinction, while our present world still hums with abundant, if threatened, life. To equate them directly would be exaggeration, but the patterns, the directions, carry unsettling resonance. For poets and dreamers, the comparison is irresistible. The Great Dying shows us how fragile abundance can be, how quickly ecosystems can unravel once thresholds are crossed. It tells us that even the mightiest lineages can fall, that dominance is no shield against collapse. In the light of modern climate change, it becomes both warning and prophecy. We are not reliving the past, but we are rhyming with it. And in that rhyme lies the haunting question: will we learn from stone or repeat its silence? To reflect on the Permian is to see our present more clearly. In both times, Earth was alive with richness, until tipping points were reached. Today, as carbon accumulates and climates swing, we find ourselves standing at thresholds. The rocks whisper to us across 2052 million years. Endings are possible. Silence is real, but choices matter. When scientists speak of the present as a potential sixth extinction, they do so with data that mirrors the fossil record of past crises. Amphibians vanish from wetlands. Insects decline in forests. Coral reefs bleach and crumble. Signs of weakening diversity echo the decline layers. Paleontologists see in Permian rocks. Each disappearance may seem small in isolation, but together they form a pattern. Ecosystems unraveling at their seams, becoming fragile and simplified, much like the monotonous Triassic landscapes that followed the Great Dying. The drivers of modern change are multiple, but they converge in familiar ways. Carbon emissions drive global warming, reshaping climates at a pace species cannot match. Deforestation mirrors the collapse of Permian forests, stripping soils of nutrients and releasing carbon once locked away. Pollution fills rivers and seas, choking out life just as anoxia did in ancient oceans. Overfishing reduces marine diversity, weakening resilience against change, and invasive species, carried by human trade, alter ecosystems in ways that recall the sudden ecological imbalances that followed past extinctions. Scientists frame these changes within the concept of the Anthropocene, a proposed new epoch defined by human activity as a geologic force. Unlike the Siberian traps, the emissions today come not from fissures in Earth's crust, but from factories, engines, and power plants. Yet the outcome is the same: greenhouse gases thickening the atmosphere, temperatures rising, oceans changing. We are, in effect, a volcanic force of our own making, rewriting the chemistry of the planet at a speed evolution struggles to match. Mainstream caution tempers this picture. Earth today is not yet the barren silence of the early Triassic. Modern ecosystems still host immense richness. Rainforests with millions of species, oceans filled with whales, sharks, and coral reefs. The Great Dying unfolded over tens of thousands of years, whereas our industrial age has lasted only centuries. Comparisons must be careful, yet the trajectory is undeniable. If unchecked, today's changes could scale into crises as profound as those etched into stone. Speculation pushes us further. Are our myths of apocalypse, floods, fire, silence, not only echoes of deep time, but warnings of our own making? Perhaps humanity, sensing its impact, tells these stories as a subconscious confession. We imagine worlds drowned or burn because we see our own fingerprints on the climate, our own shadows stretching into the future. The Great Dying shows us that the planet can endure such upheaval, but it also reminds us that life, once lost, takes millions of years to recover. For humans, tied to fragile societies, the timescale is unimaginable. Poetic reflection sharpens the point. The Great Dying teaches us that dominance does not guarantee survival, that even the rulers of their age can vanish in silence. Today, humanity is Earth's dominant lineage. We span continents, build cities, shape climates, but in deep time, our rule may be fleeting. The rocks do not record power, they record survival. And survival, the Great Dying reminds us, belongs not always to the mighty, but to the adaptable, the hidden, the humble. The closing lesson of the Great Dying is not only about collapse, but about choice. Earth's history shows that life can endure almost unimaginable catastrophe, yet recovery takes millions of years. For humans, bound by far shorter timescales, that delay would be indistinguishable from permanent loss. The forests that vanish in decades will not regrow in our lifetimes. The coral reefs that bleach today will not rebuild for millions of years if they collapse entirely. The silence of extinction is deep, and once it falls, it lingers far longer than we can conceive. Scientists caution that we are not doomed to repeat the Permian. Unlike the creatures of that age, we can see the danger unfolding, measure its pace, and understand its drivers. Satellites track warming oceans, ice cores reveal atmospheric change, fossils warn us of precedent. Knowledge gives us what the synapsids and trilobites never had, foresight. But foresight without action is only prophecy. The stone tells us what can happen. The present asks whether we will choose different. Speculation sharpens this into a haunting question. Are we living at the edge of another great dying? The evidence is partial, the trends contested, yet the possibility is real. We already witness extinctions accelerating, habitats shrinking, and climates shifting. To some, these are warnings that humanity's age of abundance is fragile. To others, they are manageable challenges. The truth, as always, may lie in between, but the rocks whisper of thresholds, and thresholds, once crossed, are rarely reversible. Poetic reflection invites humility. The Great Dying reminds us that dominance is no shield. The mightiest predators of the Permian, the gorgonopsids, fell silent. The most abundant ocean dwellers, the trilobites, vanished forever. Their reigns lasted longer than ours has yet endured, and still they crumbled in the face of planetary upheaval. Humanity, for all its cities and machines, is no less bound to Earth's system. If we poison seas, strip forests, and thicken skies, we may discover that our rule is as temporary as theirs. Yet the story need not end in silence. Unlike the Permian creatures, we can alter our path. Choices to curb emissions, preserve ecosystems, and protect diversity are more than political debates. They are acts of survival written against the backdrop of deep time. To act is to heed the lessons of stone, to recognize that what vanishes does not return quickly, that recovery measured in millions of years offers no comfort to beings who live only decades. The great dying offers us a mirror. In it, we see both fragility and resilience, endings and beginnings. It reminds us that life endures, but also that it forgets. Whole lineages erased, whole possibilities undone. As we stand in our own age of change, the question remains open. Will we become another echo in the rock, or will we write a different story? The silence of the Permian is a warning, but also an invitation. The future is not yet fixed. The story of the great dying is vast, stretching across hundreds of thousands of years written into stone and silence. Yet as we bring this journey to a close, what lingers is not only the scale of loss, but the resilience that followed. Earth has always been fragile, yet it has always endured. Its memory is carried in rocks, in fossils, in the quiet persistence of survivors who rebuilt the world from almost nothing. Tonight, as we drift toward rest, we carry that same truth within us. Fragility and resilience, endings and beginnings, bound together in a single rhythm. Think of the silence that followed the great dying. Forests collapsed, oceans turned black, and creatures that had endured for millions of years vanished forever. It was an emptiness beyond imagination, a pause in life's song that lasted for ages. And yet, within that silence, tiny survivors clung on, burrowing cynodonts, hardy plants, small insects, ammonites drifting in poisoned seas. From their persistence, the earth's music began again, slowly, faintly, then louder, until the Triassic dawned with strange new worlds and new lineages. Even the deepest silence was not final. This cycle of death and renewal has echoed throughout Earth's history. 5 mass extinctions scar the record of life, each one seeming to close the book, only for evolution to turn the page and write anew. For the creatures who perished, each ending was absolute. For the survivors, each ending became a beginning. It is a truth at once sobering and comforting. Endings are real, yet they are never the whole story. Life, in its quiet resilience, always finds a way forward. For us, the lesson is both humbling and soothing. We live at a moment of abundance, surrounded by forests, oceans, and skies alive with sound. Yet the rocks remind us how fragile that abundance can be. At the same time, they remind us of resilience, that even in the harshest silence, life endured, and from endings came beginnings. We are part of that same lineage, carried forward through deep time by survivors who held on when the world seemed lost. As you rest tonight, imagine the earth not as static, but as a great, breathing story. Imagine the forests of the Permian, now gone, their echoes lingering in coal seams. Imagine the ammonites of the Triassic seas, ancestors of the cephalopods still drifting today. Imagine the small cynodonts huddling in their burrows, carrying within them the seeds of mammals and eventually of us. To dream with the ancients is to recognize that we are woven into this deep tapestry, a thread in a fabric billions of years old. Let the rhythm of that truth guide you into calm. Life is fragile, yet enduring. Silence is real, yet never permanent. The earth remembers more than we ever will, its diary etched in stone, its chapters spanning ages. And tonight, you rest as part of that same story, carried on the breath of survivors, cradled in the resilience of life itself. As you drift towards sleep, hold this thought close. Even in silence, the earth remembers, and from endings come beginnings. The great dying was not the end. It was a turning of the page. And so too, in your own life, every silence, every ending, carries within it the quiet seed of renewal. Rest gently now, held by the memory of forgotten ages, and dream in the comfort of Earth's enduring story.